Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Five podcast. I'm again joined by Nathan C.J. Hood to discuss on our fourth Tolkien Hour episode, the Eucatastrophe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. Don't forget to support me on Locals, Buy Me a Coffee, and Subscribestar. And as per usual, near the end of the show, we will engage with the chat. Sleepers will be read first, and any other comments that are either pertinent or as time allows will be looked at. So what sort of got me started on this whole thought process of discussing the Eucatastrophe is there's a really sort of obnoxious tendency that I find amongst a lot of trad cons, especially Calvinist trad cons, that they're kind of like, miffing it in life. And they're like, and then life gets worse and worse. And, since we're talking about trad cons, I tell their wife and kids, well, don't worry, Christ is still on the throne. That's true. And Christ will still win. But if you're miffing it all the time, are you sure you're on the winning team? It's sort of like the fact that the Eucatastrophe is going to happen is used as an excuse to not do your part. Whereas if we look at the Lord of the Rings, those people who are serious and take this threat of Sauron and Saruman and overcoming their own inner weaknesses when tempted by the ring or despair from the Palantir like Denethor, they win, but they don't have this kind of like glib, cavalier attitude to the conflict. Well, Sauron will be beat eventually. We can just kind of hang around and do whatever. And I thought, well, how can we sort of address this situation? And I think in one part, talking about the nature of the catastrophe as Tolkien understands it, and then how that should, rather than leading one to a kind of cavalier, happy-go-lucky attitude, should instead lead to a more serious attitude like we find in the books itself. So catastrophe means sudden turn of events. And EU means good, like a eulogy is a good account of someone's life at death. So eucatastrophe is a sudden change for the good. So Tolkien in On Fairy Stories writes, but the constellation of fairy tales has another aspect in the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the constellation of the happy ending. Almost all, I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function, but the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there was no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. It is in its fairy tale or other world setting. It is as sudden and marvelous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the excellence of the existence of discatastrophe or sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of the deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and in so far in Evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. It is the mark of a good fairy story on the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to the child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to or indeed accompanied by tears as keen as that given by any form of literary art and having a particular quality. Now, this is from letter 89. I coined the word eucatastrophe, the sudden happy turn in a story, which pierces you with joy that brings tears, which I argued it is the highest function of the fairy stories to produce. And I was there to lead the view that it produces its particular effect because it's a sudden glimpse of truth. It perceives, if the story has a literary truth, that this is indeed how things really do work in the great world for which our nature is made. And I concluded by saying that the resurrection was the greatest eucatastrophe possible in the greatest fairy story and produces that essential emotion. Christian joy, which produces tears because it is qualitatively so like sorrow, but because it comes from those places where joy and sorrow are at one, reconciled, as selflessness and altruism are lost in love. And we see this idea in the book itself, in the Return of the King, where Gandalf at the Grey Haven says, "Yes," said Gandalf, "for it will be better to ride back 3 together than 1 alone. Well, here at least, dear friends, on the shores of the sea comes the end of our fellowship in Middle-earth." Go in peace. I will not say, do not weep, for not all tears are evil. So here we have like this sort of like inner Tolkien voice through Gandalf saying that there's this eucatastrophic feeling at the end with the Grey Havens where the three hobbits that are left behind, Fred, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, are justified in crying, but it's a cry of joy and loss. And so that's interesting. The other thing is also he furthermore elaborates. Oh, I just read that letter 89. Okay, the other thing then is this is fundamentally similar to this kind of concept in if the eucatastrophe in history is the resurrection, as he says, the eucatastrophe at the end of history is Jerusalem coming down to earth in Revelation 21. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So this heavenly Jerusalem, heaven, is now coming to earth. Now, within an actual fairy story, one for which I can only assume Tolkien must have been familiar, is The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. And this is an account at the end after the King of Elfland, a spoiler alert, breaks the third rune and brings Elfland into the real world. And now from the upper window of the houses, the folk began to see that glittering line, which was no earthly twilight. They saw it flash at them with that starry gleam and then flow onwards towards them. Slowly it came, as though it rippled with difficulty over earth's rugged bulk, though moving lately over the rightful lands of the Elf King. And it outsped the comet, and hardly had they wondered at its strangeness when they found themselves almost amongst familiar things, for the old memories that floated before it as a wind before the thunder beat in a sudden gust on their hearts and their houses, and lo, they were living once more amongst them things long past and lost. And at that line of no earthly light came, near the rustle before it, a sound as of rain on leaves. Old sighs breathed over again, old lovers' whispers repeated, and there fell on these folks, as they all leaned hushed from the windows, a mood that looked gently, wistfully backward through time, such a mood as might lurk by a huge dock leaves in ancient gardens when everyone is gone, that has tended the roses or ever loved the bowers. So we see here with Dunsany, this is clearly a sort of fantastical retelling of Revelation 21, where Elfland is a stand-in for heaven or the higher realm of the forms or whatever, and it's coming into history. So this is like a sort of end of history eucatastrophe rather than the middle of history eucatastrophe. Nathan.
Yeah, thanks for spoiling the ending of Elfland. That's I don't need to read the rest of the book now, Todd. But yes, I think I think you've hit on a number of really excellent points in terms of articulating the key of eucatastrophe as this joyous turn. And I think another example would be the Field of Cormelin. So after the ring is destroyed, which, well, maybe it'd be worth actually just discussing that first, as maybe the primary eucatastrophe of the whole of the Lord of the Rings. Because I think one thing that distinguishes the Lord of the Rings from the Silmarillion is the Silmarillion really only has one major eucatastrophe, which is right at the end. Maybe we can get into that later. But in general, it's a story of tragedy, of continuous defeat or ending towards defeat. Whereas the Lord of the Rings, the plot is a series of eucatastrophes throughout, and the heroes are constantly being rescued by unexpected graces or forces they didn't expect to arrive just in time, save the day. But right at the end of the Lord of the Rings, Frodo, he's reached Mount Doom. All he has to do is drop the ring into the fires below and destroy it. And he is broken. He's defeated. I will not say he failed, because I think that's a bit too harsh. Tolkien himself writes in several letters that it's more akin to being beaten up by a stronger person, right? Frodo his will was just not strong enough to resist the ring in that place. And Tolkien reckons pretty much nobody would have been able to do that. We could argue about Tom Bombadil, but put that aside for a second. So it looks like the quest is doomed. Frodo's taken the ring for himself. Sauron's going to be victorious. The soldiers at the Black Gate, Aragorn and Gandalf and all them, they're all going to get killed. The ring's going to be returned to Sauron, and he will dominate the rest of Middle Earth. But then Gollum attacks Frodo. He takes the ring for himself, so it looks even worse. Gollum's got it now, but in his jubilation, he slips off the edge, falls into the fires below. The ring is destroyed. And in some of the letters that Tolkien wrote, he even implied that this wasn't just a chance or luck thing. That actually, he says, the author of the story. By this, I do not mean myself. So he's implying there's a providence or fate or Iluvatar's hand at work here, intervened and brought about the destruction of the ring. So this is the great Eucatastrophe at the end of the Lord of the Rings. And afterwards, at the Field of Cormellan, so this kind of revelation scene where, you know, Aragorn and his court are gathered there. Frodo and Sam are presented, and they sing the praises of Frodo and Sam. They tell the tale. There's a bard who tells the tale, and Sam just bursts into tears because he's overwhelmed with joy, and but with a tinge of sorrow. So that's what. So when you were mentioning the Grey Havens, I couldn't help but think of that scene too, which is I guess the closest in the film is like when Frodo wakes up in the bedroom and they all come in and just start laughing. That's the kind of feeling that you have when a eucatastrophe's happened, or you read about a eucatastrophe.
Yeah. Now, obviously, the Lord of the... So you made a good point about the sort of invisible providence, right? So example, I think it's in the movie, it's in Moria, but in the book, Gandalf and Frodo are still in Hobbiton, still in Bag End, and he says that you were meant to find the ring because it's the pity of Bilbo that will rule the fate of the world. And of course, that's an offhand remark about Uru Iluvatar. And I think the key aspect here about a eucatastrophe is that if it's seen in isolation as a mere narrative device, a lot of critics are going to say, well, that's just, you're just assuming all the luck breaks in your favor, all the statistical probabilities break in your favor. And only from a materialist point of view could you really say that, because what Tolkien is really saying is, of course, this isn't chance. Of course, this isn't how it would happen if we just expected everything as we see it to run. It's pointing to this higher order reality, which is it's itself an expression of the divine providence, which is Uru Iluvatar. So, and then of course we also can say this because he points to the fact that Christ in history is the in history eucatastrophe, and of course all of the prophecies about Christ that Christ would fulfill. Again, that's not going to happen by accident. The fact that it does happen entails that there was someone. Well, Einstein said God doesn't play dice, right? So he doesn't have to play the probability game. He just, imposes that through this higher plan. And so, in that regard, Lord of the Rings is kind of like Esther. God isn't named; he's not in it, but he's in it in his non. He's in it in his non-definition, because what else explains everything breaking in a certain way? Him being there. Now, as far as eucatastrophe being a sudden change for good, I admit there aren't that many in the Silmarillion, but I think we have a few. One, of course, is Arendil sailing to Valinor. He's the only mortal who's able to do that and survive, so that's the first eucatastrophe. And then he gets the message to the Valar, to the elves that never left, and then they raise an army to defeat Morgoth. So that's at least two eucatastrophes. But I could even argue that if we look at the lineage that gives rise to Arendil, the fact that his sires and mothers don't get killed and escape from city to city is a kind of eucatastrophe built within, because it's only Arendil who can do this. Nobody else can. And so he has to be born. He has to have the Silmaril. And that's where the whole that's the Silmaril that Beren and Luthien got. So you could argue that Luthien putting Morgoth or Melkor to sleep is a eucatastrophe. So I think while the overarching tone of the Silmarillion is tragedy, I think there are eucatastrophic events in it which lead to the birth of Arendil, him acquiring the Silmaril. And I think what this indicates is the fact that he possesses the Silmaril, and unlike for most people who possess it, it doesn't lead to some tragedy. Beren loses a hand. Way to channel your tear there, huh, Tolkien? But then you also have Dior, who's killed by the sons of Fëanor, and then was it Maglor throws it into the sea. Well, his version, but he's one of the only guys who can actually acquire the Silmaril and not be corrupted by it, by the oath of Fëanor, which I think itself is a foreshadowing of his virtue and purity, which is why he's able to successfully go to Valinor in the first place. He's already been tested with the Silmaril, and he passed the test, proving his purity of purpose and mission. It's sort of like in fantasy where you have like a weapon that says only the pure of heart can use it, and if the villain picks it up, it either kills him or almost kills him. And so the Silmaril is kind of like that. And so I think there are eucatastrophic elements in the Silmarillion, even though the broader tone is tragic.
Oh, totally, and that's the example I was thinking of was Erendil. I think you could make the connection even stronger in terms of, I think you could present him as a type of Christ. So he's not an exact replica. He's more like an Old Testament figure who prefigures in certain ways Christ, and that includes his eucatastrophic elements too. So he acts as the mediator between men and elves and the Valar, and this is because of his two natures. He is part man, part elf. It's not it's not an exact copy of divine human Christ, because he's it's genetic, it's biological, but it's there's a parallel there. As you say, he is able to bring the Silmaril into Valinor, and it's out of love for his people that he's able to cross over the oceans as well, and he is spared from judgment by Manwë. You then, as you say, you have the eucatastrophe of the War of the Valar upon Morgoth, but then right in the middle of the battle, there's actually another eucatastrophe led by Erendil, because at that moment, is it Ancalagon the Black? He comes forth. Yeah, he comes forth and he pushes back the Valar, and it looks like they might even be defeated at this point. And then out of the sky on his ship Vingalot, Erendil, who's really the light of the world as well, because he's raised into the sky already as a star. So you've got this connection with Christ again, the light of the world. He enters the fray and slays Ancalagon, thus achieving victory. So you have two eucatastrophes, like the incarnation and the resurrection, which is the defeat of, Satan and death. And following that, the language Tolkien uses is so reminiscent of biblical passages. So he talks about the pits of Morgoth's realm being opened, and the slaves therein are freed. So it's like the harrowing of hell motif, Christ releasing the trapped in Hades, the righteous from Hades. Then he talks about the valleys and the mountains are lowered. The valleys are raised and the mountains are lowered. So every valley will be exalted, and so on, like in Isaiah, which is prophesies of the coming of God and judgment. So Tolkien's very consciously comparing Erendil to Christ, I think, at the very end of the Silmarillion. And so if we're tying this in with the eucatastrophe idea, he is a typological character or prefigurement, not just of Christ's person, but also the eucatastrophe that Christ will achieve. And I think that's partly why it makes sense to have less eucatastrophes in the Silmarillion than Lord of the Rings, because he's trying to say something about Christ through Erendil, if you see what I mean. If there's more eucatastrophes, it somewhat lessens the sheer amazingness and miraculousness of Erendil's victory, and thus how he points to Christ.
Yeah, I think we can also argue that the three human heroes that really stand out in the Silmarillion, Beren, Tuor, and Erendil, are all eucatastrophic in their own way. Erendil being, of course, the most important, the one that actually rounds this out. You could also argue that in the Akalabath, the destruction of Numenor, which is often included in the Silmarillion, the escape of Elendil is a eucatastrophe, because it's ultimately Elendil's son, Isildur, that defeats Sauron for the first time. with Sauron as the new Dark Lord. I mean, Sauron was defeated by Huan, the Silmarillion, but he was not ruling in his own capacity. Sauron ruling in his own capacity is defeated for the first time by Isildur. So we have this Eucatastrophe where Elendil, well, not only that, he takes the seeds of the White Tree, which go all the way back to Telperion and Laralan, and then he takes the seeds, he escapes, he takes his son, and then so the line of the two trees from Valinor is preserved, and his own line, which then allows for the first defeat of Sauron, and then the second, because Aragorn is heir to Isildur.
So I want to maybe push back a little bit or challenge a little bit here in terms of, I wonder if there's a useful distinction between a happy fault and a eucatastrophe. And so the happy fault tradition, the Felix Culpa, it's this idea that with the fall of Adam, and I think Augustine kind of promotes this idea first. This wasn't a mistake or necessarily a bad thing, because it allowed for the conditions for which Christ could come into the world, because a redeemer is needed. So although in itself it's evil, there's a greater good which emerges from this evil. And so something like the Excalibur strikes me as that sort of situation, because although it's an evil thing, the greater good is that Isildur was there to slay, well, take the ring off Sauron, essentially. Whereas a eucatastrophe, it seems, is much more this idea of reversal. So you've got this moment of defeat or impending ultimate defeat, which is overturned and it becomes victory. So something like the Battle of Helm's Deep would be a very good example of this, where, you know, they've been pushed back to the Hornburg. It looks like the Uruk-hai are going to kill them all. And then right at that moment, Gandalf and Erkenbrand appear with the Riders of Rohan and are able to save the day. And then the Huons are also there to mop up at the end. That's not quite the same thing as a happy fault, because it's not an evil thing in itself. So I wonder, do you think there's a useful distinction there between these two kinds of things, which are very closely related? They're very similar, and I think they tie in with each other. So, like, Gollum taking the ring is a happy fault, which ends up being the means of eucatastrophe right at the end of the story. So maybe they overlap, but I think there might be room for a distinction there. What do you think, Todd?
There might be, but let me okay, let's deal with the scope issue, because there might be an issue of scope here. In the Excalibur, Tolkien describes the loyal Númenóreans as, I think, the faithful, and they're persecuted, and so for them, right, everything is getting worse. Well, yeah, certainly the Empire of Al-Farazon is this bloated empire which has colonies all over. I almost think this is a kind of like parody criticism of the British Empire, where, like, you know, it has this overseas empire ruling through, you know, cruelty, and then is sunk. But of course, there's the Atlantis story as well, so you could refer it to that. But from their point of view, everything's getting worse. Sauron is taking over Númenor. The Númenóreans are falling away from proper reverence to the, for lack of a better word, gods of Valinor. And yet somehow Isildur is able, I forget who gives him the message, but he gets this flash of inspiration to leave. And it looks like everything is going to just go to pieces. But from the perspective of the faithful, can't we argue that's a eucatastrophe? All of these terrible developments ultimately force him to leave Númenor so that he can build a new kingdom on the Middle-earth mainland, which then leads to the events that lead to the fall of Sauron.
I can see what you're saying. I think, though, it's what you said at the end. It leads to the fall of Sauron. It's not an immediate reversal of the situation.
So it's gradual. So
yeah,
we call it eugradualism.
Eugradualism, I'll take that. Yeah, that sounds
so
good.
it's a happy gradual effect.
But certainly maybe like I can't remember the story exactly, but you know, you mentioned this moment of inspiration, and so them being saved by being on the boats when the flood takes place. That's the eucatastrophic moment in that story. It's they were rescued, even just before they were about to be all killed. So that I think you could identify it there.
Okay. The other thing that's, I think, relevant, at least to the thought process that led me here, was what, given that, I'm sort of tired and put out with people that sort of glibly trust in everything working out fine in Christ, which I believe it will. Then the question is, will you be there for it? And I think it's helpful to look at the characters in Middle Earth that lacked certain virtues, certain strengths of character that led them to not be a part of the Eucatastrophic victory. The obvious example is Denethor, right? If Denethor had been on Team Aragorn and just waited it out, he would have won. But he gave in to despair because he using the Palantir saw only what Sauron wanted him to see. And by only seeing what Sauron wanted him to see and having a fatal conceit of his own intellect, and again, Denethor is a very wise and proud man. Well, pride and love of his own knowledge was what brought him down. But the thing is, if he had, for lack of a better word, faith, he, like his son Faramir, he could have continued to see the end, because again, the defeat of Sauron was in some sense outside of his control. But he had to play his part to see it, and he didn't. Another example is Saruman. Saruman was sent with the other four wizards, Gandalf, Radagast, Alatar, and Palando, in order to lead the free peoples of Middle-earth against Sauron. And again, had he just played his role, he would have lived to see the end of Sauron. But his pride led to a different fault. He didn't despair. He wanted to become the new Dark Lord. And Tolkien tells us that you can become a new Dark Lord if you take the ring. But that's the only way you can, quote, beat Sauron. You don't take the ring for good like Boromir and then win. You only win by having a stronger will to supplant him. And so that was Saruman's bad end. And so what we have with at least these two characters especially is that they, well, even Boromir, right? He could have lived to see the Eucatastrophe had he not forced Frodo and sort of foreshadowed his own doom in the process. And the characters that successfully resist the will of the ring, which we've discussed in a previous episode, are those that have what we might call understanding the limits of epistemic knowledge. They know their limits. They know what they can do and what they can't. And they know that the ring is lying to them. I already mentioned how Sam, he's brave and courageous. He's not necessarily very smart, but he knows enough to know that the ring. So sorry, you could be wise like Galadriel, or you could be simple like Sam. But both of them, knowing their limits, knows that the ring would take them over. And so it's lack of understanding of limits. Denethor and Boromir do not understand their own limits or the limits of the ring. So, or despair. Denethor despairs by only seeing what he's told to see. Saruman, it's the lust for power that the ring gets him. And of course, he doesn't understand the limits either. And so you see this element, and I think a lot of people who in our world would agree with Tolkien that there's a Eucatastrophe in history with Christ and at the end with the Revelation. They think that they're either Galadriel's and Gandalf's on the one hand or Sam's on the other, but they're really Denethor's and Saruman's.
Well, I think in part, the issue is that they don't take seriously the discatastrophe which is required as part of the Eucatastrophe. Let me explain what I mean by that. As you said, for Tolkien, the idea that there's the prospect of ultimate defeat just around the corner is vital to understanding the reversal or turn. And in one of his most famous lectures on Beowulf, he kind of, I think he really goes into this idea in quite some depth. He contrasts a Greek and Norse mythology, and by extension Saxon mythology, with the Norse. And in his view, Greek mythology differs quite significantly in relation to the monsters and their relationship to humanity. Because when Odysseus fights the Cyclops, he's fighting a son of Poseidon. And so this is really a conflict between different gods, factions essentially, There's not a kind of absolute good and evil. Whereas when you come to the Norse story, you have the Aesir and Odin leading them, and they are in a perpetual conflict against the monsters of the world, the giants and so on. And they have allied. Odin has chosen, the brave warriors to come, from death to Valhalla and fight for him at Ragnarok. But crucially, it's inevitable, it's fixed in fate that the gods will lose. The monsters are going to win at Ragnarok. They're going to kill all of the gods, and ultimate defeat will happen. He quotes somebody on this point, a guy called Kerr, halfway through the lecture. The northern gods have an exultant extravagance in their warfare, which makes them more like Titans than Olympians. Only they are on the right side, though it is not the side that wins. The winning side is chaos and unreason, mythologically the monsters, but the gods who are defeated think that defeat no refutation. And he goes on to explain that Beowulf and Saxon poems also have this tenor. Beowulf, this great man, this mighty man, he initially has to go and fight Grendel at Heorot, defending this place of safety and security from this monster which embodies the idea of death, of the impending darkness coming. And he's able to stave off that darkness for a while. He kills Grendel and Grendel's mother. But then towards the end of the poem, a dragon attacks Beowulf's homeland, and he goes to fight it. And throughout that part of the poem, it's repeated by the author that fate was inflexible. Beowulf was going to meet his end facing this dragon. There's nothing he could do to stop this from happening. He kills the dragon, but is himself slain. And then a Geatish woman, right when the burial is taking place, or the cremation, I should say, she says that she dreads the days to come, dark with carnage and keening, terror of the enemy, humiliation and captivity. So in the Norse imagination and in the Saxon imagination, although we're able to stave off evil for a time, eventually it's going to win. Everything comes to an end. Darkness has its day of victory. And it's probably quite similar to like Turin Turinbar in terms of tone, that no matter what Turin does, Morgoth's curse and Glaurung's activities just lead to endless misery until he is finally, he ends up killing himself. I think that's the first kind of point that you need to take with Eucatastrophe. If you have that view, if you have this idea that the darkness will probably win, or is inevitably going to win, that has to be the beginning point of a Eucatastrophe, or understanding it properly, because then you see how serious it is as an idea, but then also that it's not just something that you can dismiss, because if you almost have to believe that this point of view, if you see what I mean, you have to be willing to have the courage to fight, even though you're going to be defeated.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of points I want to unpack here. So,
yeah,
but on the one hand, there is this, amongst modern Christians of most stripes, there's this idea that we're not going to suffer defeats. Well, hey, it goes back to the ancient times. I'll give you a good example. I mentioned this to you last time, Nathan C.J. Hood. In Book 20 of the City of God, Augustine says, it's so good, bros. All the kingdoms of the world that are currently Christian will remain Christian until the end of history. A completely nonsense position, by the way. History has since proven that false. There's a sense in which we've already won, guys. We don't have to worry about the struggles. They're going to be, France will be Christian till the end. Algeria will be Christian to the end. This goes into a much broader discussion about immanentizing the eschaton that we see first attempted in the 4th century, which is somewhat beyond the scope of this discussion. But why I brought up Augustine is that it's an old error to fall into. Christ has won, but that doesn't mean that we won't suffer defeats in the meanwhile. And Tolkien takes a far more realistic attitude of that. Now, we could call this position. It doesn't start with Augustine, but I think he's a very good expression of it. We can call that the laughing warrior attitude, that you go into battle laughing, whereas nobody laughs in the Lord of the Rings until maybe the end. You know, the Rohirrim don't go into battle laughing; they chant death, riding to the world's ending. There's nothing funny about this fight. It's a serious business, and I contrast C.S. Lewis to Tolkien here, especially in his space trilogy. He has this kind of laughing warrior attitude, which doesn't take evil and defeat seriously, especially in Perelandra, where Ransom just gives the unmanned a good drubbing and it's all good. And in fact, his own victory in the individual fight is never really in doubt. Now, you know, whereas if you read Lord of the Rings, nobody goes into battle thinking we're going to win. And you mentioned the Battle of the Black Gate. They go there expecting to all die. Like they think that, look, you know what? Even if Frodo destroys the ring, we may not live to see the end. So it's a totally opposite attitude. And this time of evil's ascendancy, Christ even says so, right? Or so the Eucatastrophe in history, he says that this is the hour of darkness. This is your hour, you know, saying that to Satan. And so Satan does have his day, right? He does have his hour. And that we might call that the long night of the soul, the valley of the shadow of death. Not taking that seriously is where despair creeps in, because you don't win when you thought you were going to, or it turns out to be a lot harder than you thought it was. And I think that's where we have one of the forks that leads to the Denethor outlet, which ends in suicide.
I agree, and I think in a way, you know, you mentioned the Rohirrim shouting death. They, you know, they're based on Anglo-Saxons. It seems like they're embodying that spirit, that northern heroic spirit of in another poem, the Battle of Maldon, where, you know, they're all going to be wiped out by the Vikings, but they stand resolute nonetheless, and they put more spirit into it, because that's what you do, right? You don't just back down and run away. You fight till the end. I think, though, and you've kind of alluded to this, Tolkien is giving an answer to the northern mindset of darkness will win, because there is resurrection, and so there is Eucatastrophe at the end of these things. So he is responding in a way to the Norse and to the Saxon, saying, actually, no, look, there is a turning point at the end, but you're right not to take that for granted, because, as he says, it's unexpected, not looked for. If you expect it, you're automatically going to have the wrong attitude. But then if you don't have any hope that there could be even a small chance of it, well, then as you say, you end up like Denethor, who's resigned himself from the world, who burns himself on a pyre. And I couldn't help but think of Brunhilde at the end of the Ring Cycle, who in a Schopenhauerian resignation of the will, it's meant to be, gives herself up and burns on the pyre to return the ring. It seems like he's also responding to that with Denethor, saying, no, actually, resignation is not the answer in that sense.
Right. So from the Christian point of view, we have in Matthew 10:22, and you will be hated by all men for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. Now, this idea of enduring to the end will be saved. Right now, the idea is this is where the Eucatastrophe comes in. Despite the fact that it looks like evil's winning in the short term all around us, evil will lose. And the only question is, what side do we want to be on? Are we going to trade short-term pleasure for long-term security? Right? We read in Hebrews that Moses gave up pleasures of sin for a season in Egypt in order for an imperishable reward. And the issue is, what does this mean then? I think one of the things that we see with Tolkien really well, unfortunately a little bit less well with Lewis, and certainly a good deal less well with modern day Christians, is the idea of courage. The idea that you endure under seemingly impossible odds for what is right. A perfect example of courage in the modern world, unfortunately, is coming from Islam. Right before the Taliban took over Afghanistan the second time, they were being interviewed by Vice, and this one guy, this Taliban fighter, was saying, Well, look, everything is jihad, everything is struggle. We win if we keep fighting the Americans. And I'm just like, you can't beat that. Like if fighting the Americans continually is winning, there's no way you're going to beat that spirit. And that's why the Taliban won. Also, if one of our brothers dies, they go to Allah, right? So dying is winning. So if continual fighting is winning and dying is winning, then yeah, you can't beat that side. Now, ultimately, as Christians, I would argue a Muslim doesn't have the right to believe that, but the Christian does. But how many Christians will say that? you know?
Or live it.
Yeah.
I think of Paul's line, "To live is Christ, and to die is gain," as perfectly summing up what you've just said there. But we can see it in characters in Lord of the Rings too. The fact that Gandalf. Tolkien writes in one of his letters, and I'm sorry I can't remember which one, that at the moment where he faced the Balrog, he could have taken the ring then and used it, because he would have crushed the Balrog with that, right? And also he doesn't know that like anybody else in the world is going to be able to like guide this quest. He's like the best person to do this, to guide Frodo to Mordor. It takes an incredible act of courage and faith to say, no, I'm going to do the right thing here and stop the Balrog from attacking and let them go on their way. I'm going to put my life down for this quest. And he doesn't know he'll come back. He doesn't know that. I think there's often this kind of assumption, oh, Gandalf knew he would come back, or it was the natural part of the story to happen. No, he doesn't know that, but he's willing to do that anyway. And then you've mentioned the Black Gate. They're all willing to give up their lives to allow Frodo's mission to succeed, even if there's a slight chance that it draws Sauron's attention and the orcs out of Mordor. They're willing to take it, even if they're not there to see the end of it. So I totally agree with you that spirit is crucial to the completion of the quest. If those characters didn't have those attitudes, there wouldn't have been the destruction of the ring. It would have fallen into Sauron's hands at some point or another.
And the other thing too, as well, because I'm sort of gunning for this laughing warrior attitude, the idea that this struggle is a rugby match where you thump one side and then go to the pub afterwards to celebrate, as if that's the nature of what we're doing here. The hobbits primarily, really, if you look at the first part of the book, the only hobbit that's sensible is Merry. Frodo's a bit goofy. He puts the ring on by doing some monkey shines in Bree. Merry and Pippin are a bit goofy. Sam and Pippin are a bit goofy. And so in order for them to be the kinds of heroes that they need to be in the key moments in The Return of the King, where Sam is able to resign the ring to Frodo again once he realizes he's not dead, for Pippin to save Faramir from death by getting Gandalf and doing the courageous thing there, and of course Merry to confront the Witch King, they all have to basically grow up. They got to stop being kids. And so many people today think that they can still, and the sort of Merry warrior attitude is a kind of childish, infantilized position. And they still hold that. And so they're like the hobbits, but not in a good way, because the hobbits have to grow up. And then when they're all grown up and they can handle themselves, they go back to the Shire and clear out Sharky, and it's all good. But that doesn't happen until they go through some very serious struggles throughout the quest. And so on the one hand, we need to have that kind of a serious attitude. And if you haven't grown up yet, grow up. Gandalf once says to Pippin outside of the gates of Moria, and I'm paraphrasing it. Or sorry, no, right before he goes to Gondor to take him away after looking at the Palantir, he's going to see Denethor. And he says to him, don't mention Aragorn's name, because Aragorn is the true heir of Gondor. And Pippin's like, really? I never knew. And Gandalf's like, if your eyes have been closed and your ears have been shut all of these days, wake up now. And so many people are like Pippin. They just haven't woken up yet, and they don't want to. And spoiler, that's why we still lose. See, because part of winning is knowing what winning is, right? The heroes of the Lord of the Rings know that winning is it's sort of not what you'd expect, right? It's a sort of non-dual in the sense that Christ says, if you lose your life for my sake, you gain it, and if you gain your life, you lose it. Well, people are like, well, how does that make sense? Well, there's two orders of existence: the material world and the spiritual world, right? What Christ is saying on the face of it in the material world looks kind of absurd. But if you look higher to the spiritual level, you see that it makes sense, because the spiritual world is that which is unchanging and eternal, and the physical world is changeable. And we also see this mindset with, in the Lord of the Rings, where they're like, well, look, losing a battle would be considered losing by anybody else, but they know why they're fighting at the Black Gate. They're lost. See, they're willing to lose in order to buy time for Frodo. Now, Frodo completes the quest and they don't lose, but for them, they have a proper understanding of what winning looks like. And most Christians don't. They can, whether they're like liberal Christians or conservative Christians, as their side continually suffers setbacks, they move from the Hobbit phase of happy-go-lucky hooligans to despairing Denethor, and they don't seem to get out of that loop. And then so that's the thing here. And the people that, let's look at, you mentioned the Rohirrim at, Helm's Deep and Pelennor Fields, and even the Gondorian soldiers, the heroes that we don't know their names. They're often described as stern or stout or valorous. They have these qualities that make them, like flinty or adamant, like a rock. That's also described to the heroes themselves. Eowyn is described as a stern shield maiden of Rohan. So, but the idea is that these qualities of hardness, or at least mental toughness is probably a better word. These qualities of mental toughness are constantly referred to through these adjectival descriptions of even the heroes without a name, the Rohirrim, the Gondorians, and those little guys that just do the thing. There's a wonderful poem that illustrates this, and I think it's called "For Want of a Nail, a Kingdom Was Lost." For want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For want of a horse, the general was lost. For want of the general, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the kingdom was lost. All for the want of a nail, a kingdom was lost. And nobody wants to do that. Everybody wants to be the general running the army. But if you're a Christian, we already know who the general is, and that's Christ. And in Middle-earth, the general is Aragorn, because Gandalf is a counselor. He's not the one that actually makes the executive decisions.
Yeah, I think you've put that really well. And I just want to build off it in two directions. The one is just to respond to a comment by Vingel, who says the laughing warrior archetype is very Nordic and German, also overall Germanic. And I think we can draw this. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Todd, but I think we can make a distinction here, because I don't think that you're actually attacking like Norse humor in this regard, or the Norse warriors who humorous. With Frodo, Pippin, and Sam, it's a superficiality, or not taking it seriously enough, which is the problem at the beginning, and they have to start taking it seriously, because they almost think, like, at the very beginning of the story, they think they're pretty much safe, although they know there's a threat. They're not really aware of how much danger they're in or how helpless they are, and this is seen by the fact that they really don't take the Black Riders seriously enough at the first instance. They're just kind of watching, like, who are these creatures? If we just hide in the bushes, it'll be okay. As opposed to, having a much more terrified recognition of who they are. Or when they're in the Old Forest, they get into all this trouble, and Tom Bombadil has to come along and save them from Old Man Willow. And they're still kind of feel like it's like a little adventure, really. Whereas the Norse laughing archetype, someone like Ragnar Hairy Breeches, he literally says, "I'm laughing, shall I die? I'm going to laugh while I'm dying, being bitten by snakes." It's a kind of laconic, dark humor about the twists of fate, that no one really has control over life. That it's up to the gods and to the fates what happens. So I'm not going to take it too seriously what happens to me. I'm going to laugh at you, my enemy, and undermine the seriousness of it all. For that point, knowing full well there will be revenge in due course. So I think that's a different kind of laughing warrior archetype to the one that you were kind of commenting on it. Is
No,
that fair?
that's absolutely correct. And to
Yeah.
your point, there's a good example from The Return of the King.
Hmm.
This is when Eowyn reveals herself to the Witch King. Then Mary heard of all the sounds in that hour the strangest. It seemed that Durnhelm laughed. And the clear voice was like the ringing of steel, but no living man am I. You look upon a woman. I am Edmund's daughter. You stand between me and my lord and kin. Begone if you be not deathless, for living or dark undead. I will smite you if you touch him. So one can ask, why is Eowyn laughing here? One, the mistake of the Nazgul. He thinks he's fighting a man. At a deeper level, this could be a part of the karmic prophecy of Glorfindel, that he will be slain by not the hands of a man. Not that anyone knows about this, but everything is going according to a kind of script. And so if you're the woman that kills the Witch King, there's a sort of like, it's been scripted. You're going to laugh at the humor of the point of it because he thinks you're a man. And then Eowyn might also be laughing because it's really come to this. Theoden's dead. I'm going to have to stand up to the Witch King. And of course, he's also killed with the help of Mary the Hobbit. So yeah, there's this sense of which there's a reversal. Now, contrary to the Hobbits and contrary to these sort of like, we'll call them the rugby players. We'll beat you up in a game and then go to the pub afterwards and have fun. Eowyn's taking this very seriously. She's not laughing because it's a joke, not laughing because, she takes this as a superficial conflict, but precisely because it's this twisting of expectations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. So the second point, I actually want to kind of maybe push back a little bit, but I'm surprised because I think it's actually more in line with what you've argued on the channel before. So maybe we'll come to some convergence on this point. But when you talk of victory, it sounds like there's a mixing of temporal and spiritual victory here. Like, how do we win? And I think when you've been mentioning like Aragorn, they know that if they do this thing, Frodo might win. Therefore, that justifies what they're doing. That's true to an extent, but I think they overwhelmingly feel that they'll probably still lose nonetheless. And it's like a 1% chance that this is going to be victory. And then tying this into kind of our situation. So what's the Eucatastrophe for us? It is the incarnation and the resurrection. That's what Tolkien says. That's the turning point of history. And so the ultimate victory is going to be when God comes into history and overturns the darkness, the reign of Satan and the Antichrist and so on. There's nothing we can do up to this point. That's even if we have the right attitude, I would suggest that we cannot win temporal victory. Actually, it's going to be continual decline. The darkness will win, but it's only the power of the divine, something non-human, something beyond us, that can achieve Eucatastrophe in the real world. And so I'm maybe I've been reading too much Anglo-Saxon poetry, reading The Ruins and The Wanderer, but I'm a little bit less optimistic about victory in that sense of, if we have the right approach, we can have a victory in this world, if you see what I mean.
No, I see what you mean. Maybe if
if I've misunderstood you, I apologize.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things to say as clarification. You can tell me what you think. First of all, we can look at say that right. Okay, if we take the biblical narrative in Revelation, right up till the end, Satan, again, unless you're post-mill, and we're not going to have that argument right now, Satan gains more and more power until the Antichrist comes. So right, both amills and premills agree there's going to be an Antichrist, and he's going to unite all power unto himself. Now, eventually we're going to build to that, yes. But what I'm saying is two things. First, one is, just because things get worse in the world doesn't mean it's going to get worse for you necessarily. So we can imagine an empire in decline. But if you're able to see the signs and see the possibility for a new way of life that the declining empire allows, you can then have a better life. So, for example, how Thomas Cahill saw the Irish saved civilization. The monks were able to actually, in their own lives and in the immediate communities around them, produce a better life, even in the ruins and ashes of the Roman Empire. So, in that sense, it's a very small, circumscribed win, but I think we can do better in that sense. Now, on a larger scale, I think we can also do better. Christ says the church is 11. So we don't, it's not like you elect the right president or elect the right officials and then they get in, don't trust in princes. But if you set, leaven works both ways. The leaven of the Pharisees can corrupt you, but the leaven of Christ can improve society around you. So I would call those wins, even in time and space, even if those are not the capital W win of Christ's kingdom on earth. And then second of all, so there's an up and down aspect to this. But furthermore, this might help for anybody who's watched my relatively recent discussion with Yiz and Red Hawk. I think it was less than a fortnight ago, about his and I's different interpretations of a way to go forward for those of us in this space. I said there's a historical bottleneck coming, which is the death of the empire. And I quoted Lee Kuan Yew in his interview with Fareed Zakaria, where he said that the only way to survive the rise and fall of dynasties is to have a lifeboat of family and clan and tribe. And so it's like, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition to survive the bottleneck. If you build a family, a clan, and a tribe, you still might be exterminated. That's happened throughout history. But if you want to survive the fall of this empire, it's the only thing that will save you. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. And so I told Red Hawk, it's like, look, let's say it doesn't matter what we do. We all end up punching the same card out of here. I did the one thing that could have worked, the only thing that could have worked in this situation. And that alone merits doing it. And that's what I think, that's Aragorn's rationalization. He's not thinking at the Black Gates that we're going to win and beat Sauron, but it's the only thing he could have done to ensure that Frodo would have won, even if it's a 1% chance. It's the only thing he could have done in that situation. So tell me if that explains or untangles this.
No, I think that untangles it very much so. And one of the things that I think you can connect here is Beowulf, although he's unable to stop, the dragon, he does earlier in the story kill Grendel. He's able to stave off defeat for a number of years. So it's not like, every time you go to battle, it's going to end badly. It's more darkness and death does come eventually for every person and every empire, but you can have a time on Earth. You can have some victories. So yeah, I think you're onto something there, and especially with the kind of end of empires or declining of a regime. I was struck by, you were talking earlier about Augustine and his view that Christianity would always be maintained within certain nations. Well, then you also have another connection, Rome, the eternal city. The Romans thought it would last forever, and then it was sacked. And there is almost a sense, I still feel, even though, folks like yourself have been very strong talking about we're coming towards the end of the modern West. Many of us, and I'll include myself, don't really feel that fully yet or truly yet. But this sort of discussion helps, I think, because you can see more clearly, actually, no, it is going to come to an end at some point. That's one of the mistakes that the Christians you're talking about make, is they don't see the current state ending. It might get a little bit worse, but it'll get better again. And we'll go back to 1990s or something, right? Return to Fresh Prince, as Academic Agent would say. But that's not true. And so I appreciate that in your analysis.
So let me put it this way, right? Let's sort of wrap this up and tie it in a bow with the Tolkien analogy, right? All of us in this circle at some level agree the empire is dying and that this current order is ending. That's why once upon a time, a few years earlier in this circle, the Kali Yuga was a popular thing to point to. But what happens after the cycle's over? It starts over again, which gives you grounds for hope for a new future, one. And then two, right, the fact that we don't have a Rivendell or a Lorien now, those are those little islands holding off the darkness before the elves return to Valinor. Or, in the case of the Old Testament, the nation of Israel itself. Well, how do we get those? Well, we don't get those by sitting on our backside. We have to act intentionally in order to get them. And again, will they be conquered in the future? Probably, possibly. But the thing is, even if we can carve out a niche, a little Rivendell, so to speak, that's still a win. Because it's a haven for other people who want to join the struggle against darkness. And more to the point, equip them to do so, because they have to be in an environment that reinforces their values, that reinforces their commitment to the struggle, so they can actually fulfill the role that was ordained for them.
Couldn't agree more. And I think it's also the fact that even if Rivendell fell, even if like Tom Bombadil fell at the end of all things, the fact that they were able to exist for a few years before that is worthwhile in itself.
Yes.
As you said, that's a victory. And so the creation of such spaces or communities which are thriving, which are flourishing, which are able to resist to a certain degree is a good thing. And so I think that's one of the encouraging messages of the Lord of the Rings, that even if we're not going to get Eucatastrophe as often as they might, it's from these little groups that the materials are made by which a Eucatastrophe can take place.
Right. Well, I think what I want to spend the rest of the time with is engaging with some of the chat. I think it's relevant. You've already done that already. Vingel. So Nathan means to spoil the ending of the Silmarillion, the hypocrisy.
My apologies.
Vingel, I always well up at the Field of Cormelin scene. There you go. That's the appropriate response, right, Nathan?
Exactly.
Okay, Nico says Happy Fault has the same meaning as Eucatastrophe, maybe use a different name. No, the new Eucatastrophe is not the fall of Numenor, but the escape of Isildur is. Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at earlier.
I think so he's right, like on an etymological level, but Tolkien's definition of Eucatastrophe does distinguish it from a happy fault, because it's the reversal of a situation, whereas a happy fault doesn't necessarily include a reversal. It's just greater good comes from the fact we have this evil thing. So you could call it the happy sin, perhaps, but it's not identical, theologically speaking.
Okay. How about this? We've already defined Tolkien's use of Eucatastrophe. Would this be an acceptable definition for you of a happy fault, where Paul tells the Christian all things work together for those in Christ? So even if it's an evil act, an objectively evil act that doesn't seem to have any good in it in itself, the righteous can still benefit from that evil act because all things work towards good for those who have faith in Christ.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that what you're getting at? Okay.
Yeah. And so the original sin is the par excellence version of that, because at the time, it looks like a terrible thing, but it paves the way or provides the possibility for redemption, which is a greater thing than could have been achieved without the original sin.
Right. Not sure. I'm late. I just got here. Two of my favorite people. Well, there you go, Mouse. There you go, Nathan.
Very kind, isn't he? Very kind.
Yeah. Let's see. Anything? You already covered Vingel there, so we don't need to go back to that. Let's see here. I don't think there's anything else that I want to relate to right now. Is there anything that catches your eye?
There was one point by Nico where he mentioned that the elves overthrew Morgoth, and that this would be the model for us. But I just wanted to kind of mention that at that point, the elves weren't able to do that without the intervention of the Valar. That if Erendil had not managed to convince the Valar to come, the elves would have been defeated by Morgoth. So I think that example highlights the point that for Tolkien, Eucatastrophe requires an outside force to enter in. And really, with his with all these pointing to the incarnation and resurrection, that it's divine power which alone can kind of rescue humanity or creation from this dark fate that's beyond its powers. So I think I agree with you that we will win like the elves, but that victory will be due to divine power entering in on our behalf.
Yeah, and also too, it must be remembered that the elven army that comes is the elven army that was in Valinor, answered the summons. Because there's two groups of elves broadly: those that never went to Valinor and stayed in Middle Earth, and then those that went to Middle Earth, and then there's a third group of elves that went to Middle Earth and came back, and went to Valinor and came back, and they're the Noldor. And so there's like three broad groups of elves here, and the elves that come and really smash Morgoth are those elves that answered the summons of the Valar and stayed in Valinor, and then part of them were the repentant Noldor, that after the first kinslaying, some returned. But the primary amount of elves are those that went and stayed. And so they're quasi-divine beings at that point. Because
sorry, go ahead, Todd.
Much the same way that Morgoth wasted his strength by imbuing it into Middle-earth, the Noldor and the elves that remained, that never went to Valar in the first place, wasted their strength fighting him and each other.
Yeah, exactly. And Nico helpfully comments that that's exactly his point as well. So we're all in agreement. We all concur. The council has come to a conclusion.
Well, is there anything you want to leave us with, Nathan, before we wrap this up?
Well, as always, thank you for having me on, Todd. It's been a real pleasure, and I feel like I've learned a little bit more about Eucatastrophe through talking with you in the chat. Everybody should like and subscribe to this channel, first and foremost. Todd's doing great work, so please do that. I have my own YouTube channel. Tomorrow, I am having a show on my series English Restoration. We're going to be looking at some related themes to this, Northern Heroic Spirit. And I'm going to have Rupert August, Daughter of Albion, and Scott Mannion coming to discuss it with me. So that should be good fun and very interesting. So please do come along if that's what floats your boat. But beyond that, thank you again, Todd. Been really great.
Well, again, thank you. By the way, Nathan, what we did today, that's what winning looks like. How's that?
Amen.
All right, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off. And by the way, one last thing, guys. In 2 hours, I'll be on Yuzu's show tonight, so make sure to tune into that also.